Every day across America, teachers walk into classrooms prepared to share knowledge, inspire curiosity, and guide young minds. They come armed with lesson plans, educational resources, and perhaps a thermos of coffee to fuel their demanding day. What most don't expect is to face a life-or-death emergency that will test not just their professional training, but the very paths not taken in their lives. This is the extraordinary story of Sarah Donovan, a high school biology teacher from Portland, Oregon, whose split-second decisions in a classroom crisis would save a life, and lead to a revelation that would transform her understanding of purpose and coincidence. I've been teaching for almost 20 years, Sarah says, her eyes reflecting both the warmth and weariness that come with 2 decades in education. You prepare for so much in this profession: budget cuts, difficult parents, changing curriculums, the occasional classroom disruption. But nothing prepares you for that moment when a student collapses right in front of you, and suddenly you're the only thing standing between them and death. Sarah Donovan's journey to that pivotal moment began far from the classroom. Growing up in a small town outside of Portland, she had always been drawn to understanding how things worked, especially living things. The daughter of a nurse and a park ranger, Sarah inherited both her mother's compassion for healing and her father's reverence for natural systems. By the time she entered college, her path seemed clear: she would pursue medicine, specifically medical research. I was fascinated by molecular biology, the elegant dance of proteins and enzymes, the precise mechanisms that keep us alive, Sarah explains, her voice still animated when discussing the science that first captured her imagination. I completed my bachelor's in biochemistry with honors, then immediately enrolled in a master's program in molecular biology. My plan was to continue straight through to a PhD, then spend my life in research laboratories making discoveries that might someday save lives. With stellar grades and promising research on cardiovascular cellular regeneration, Sarah secured admission to a prestigious doctoral program at OHSU, the Oregon Health and Science University. Her colleagues and professors saw in her the rare combination of scientific rigor and creative thinking that marks exceptional researchers. But life, as it often does, had other plans. 3 months into my doctoral program, my mother was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer. Sarah's voice softens as she recalls this turning point. Dad had passed away 2 years earlier from a heart attack, so there was no decision to make. I took a leave of absence and moved back home to care for her. What began as a temporary pause became a permanent detour to support herself and her mother during this difficult time. Sarah began substitute teaching at her old high school. With her advanced science background, she was immediately in high demand. I expected to find substitute teaching tedious after the intellectual rigor of research, Sarah admits. But something unexpected happened. I discovered I loved working with students, their curiosity, their potential, the way you could see understanding dawn in their eyes during a lesson. There's an immediate feedback loop in teaching that I never experienced in the lab. As her mother's health gradually improved over the next year, Sarah found herself increasingly drawn to education. When a permanent position for a biology teacher opened at Westridge High School in Portland, she applied and was hired immediately. When Mom recovered enough to live independently again, I faced a choice: return to my doctoral studies or continue teaching. I chose the classroom. Sometimes I wondered if I was wasting my advanced training, if I should have gone back to research. But most days, looking at my students, I felt confident in my decision. What Sarah didn't realize was how her abandoned medical training would one day prove crucial in her classroom, not for teaching, but for saving a life. Patrick Miller, principal of Westridge High School for the past 8 years, has always considered Sarah one of his most valuable faculty members. Sarah isn't just any teacher, he explains from his office, surrounded by student artwork and academic achievement awards. She brings real-world experience and deep knowledge to her biology classes. She doesn't just teach the textbook, she brings science to life. Students who might never have considered careers in medicine or research suddenly see possibilities because of her passion. Sarah's advanced biology class was particularly popular, even attracting adult students from the community through Westridge's continuing education program. This program, established 5 years earlier, allowed adults to complete their high school education or simply take enrichment courses alongside traditional students. I always tell my students that scientific knowledge isn't just for passing tests or getting into college, Sarah says. I tell them that understanding how the human body works might someday help them save a life. I just didn't expect to demonstrate that quite so dramatically in my own classroom. October 12, 2023 began like any other Thursday at Westridge High School. The morning fog had just begun to lift over Portland's West Hills as students filed into the brick building, navigating the usual symphony of slamming lockers, shuffling papers, and hallway conversations. In room 237, Sarah had arrived early to set up a special demonstration for her advanced biology class. We were midway through our unit on the cardiovascular system, she recalls. That day's lesson focused specifically on cardiac arrhythmias, when the heart doesn't beat in its normal rhythm. The irony of what was about to happen doesn't escape me now. Sarah had brought in an electrocardiogram simulator that allowed students to see how different arrhythmias would appear on an ECG reading. She had also prepared an intricate model of the heart's electrical conduction system using colored yarn and small LED lights, the kind of hands-on visual aid that had become her trademark. Among the 24 students who filed into her classroom that morning was Michael Chen, a new student who had joined the continuing education program just 3 weeks earlier. At 45, he was considerably older than the typical high school student. I had noticed him from the first day because he asked such insightful questions, Sarah remembers. Not just basic things, but specific, technically sophisticated questions about cardiac electrophysiology and conduction pathways, unusually detailed for someone supposed to be learning this for the first time. But I didn't think too much of it. In continuing education, you get all kinds of students with varied backgrounds and interests. I assumed perhaps he worked in a medical-adjacent field like pharmaceutical sales or medical equipment, or maybe he had a family member with heart problems. Michael sat in his usual spot at the back of the classroom, a quiet, attentive presence who took meticulous notes and occasionally offered thoughtful comments. He was of average height with salt and pepper hair, wore wire-rimmed glasses, and typically dressed in casual but professional attire, khakis and button-down shirts, as if coming from or heading to an office job. The class began with Sarah reviewing the previous day's material on the heart's natural pacemaker, the sinoatrial node, and how it coordinates the cardiac cycle. She then moved into her discussion of arrhythmias, atrial fibrillation, ventricular tachycardia, heart blocks, and other disruptions of normal rhythm. I remember explaining how ventricular fibrillation is essentially electrical chaos in the heart, how without immediate intervention, it's rapidly fatal, Sarah says. I was showing the EKG pattern on the simulator when Michael raised his hand to ask about the specific role of potassium channels in triggering certain arrhythmias. It was such a sophisticated question. I gave a detailed answer, and he nodded thoughtfully. Less than 10 minutes later, he was on the floor, his heart in exactly the chaotic rhythm we'd just discussed. 40 minutes into the class, as Sarah was demonstrating how an AED, automated external defibrillator, analyzes heart rhythms to determine whether a shock is needed, Michael suddenly clutched his chest. His face contorted in pain, and he collapsed, falling from his chair onto the floor with a heavy thud that silenced the classroom instantly. Time did that strange thing where it both slows down and speeds up, Sarah recounts, her hands unconsciously gripping her coffee mug tighter as she recalls the moment. I remember seeing him fall and immediately telling Jenny Peterson to call 911 while I ran to him. The other student seemed frozen in shock, which is completely normal. This wasn't a drill or a demonstration going too far. This was real, and they knew it. When Sarah reached Michael, he was unresponsive. She called his name, shook his shoulder, and got no response. Following her training, she checked for breathing and a pulse. When I reached him, he wasn't breathing, and I couldn't find a carotid pulse. Everything from my research days and CPR training kicked in. I tilted his head back to open the airway, and when that didn't restore breathing, I started CPR immediately. Sarah positioned herself over Michael's chest and began compressions, mentally counting the rhythm while part of her mind strategized next steps. Between compressions, she called out to another student to go to the administrative office and have them send the school nurse immediately with the emergency medical kit. I remember being acutely aware of how crucial these first minutes were. Every minute without oxygen decreases survival chances by about 10%. The human brain begins to die after 4 to 6 minutes without oxygen. These weren't just statistics from a textbook anymore, they were the urgent reality unfolding beneath my hands. For 12 tension-filled minutes, Sarah performed CPR while waiting for paramedics. She sent another student, Marcus Williams, to retrieve the AED from its wall cabinet in the hallway outside the gymnasium. I remember being so grateful that I had pushed for AEDs to be installed throughout the school. 3 years earlier, Sarah says, some administrators had questioned the expense, but I had made a case for them based on data about sudden cardiac arrest in school settings. Never did I imagine I'd be using one on an adult in my own classroom. When Marcus returned with the AED, Sarah instructed another student to take over compressions, something she had taught them during a special health unit, while she prepared the device. She turned it on, applied the adhesive pads to Michael's exposed chest as directed by the visual guide, and then followed the automated voice instructions. The AED advised a shock was needed, which confirmed he was in ventricular fibrillation or ventricular tachycardia, both shockable rhythms. I made sure everyone was clear of contact with Michael's body, pressed the shock button, and then immediately resumed CPR. After the shock and about 2 more minutes of CPR, Michael gasped suddenly. Sarah checked and found a pulse, rapid but present. He started breathing again just as the paramedics arrived. It was perhaps the most profound moment of my teaching career, not because of anything I taught, but because knowledge had directly translated to preserving life. Paramedic Trevor Johnson was among the first responders who arrived that day. With 15 years of emergency medical experience, he has seen hundreds of cardiac arrests, and knows how rarely they end positively. When we arrived, the patient was conscious, disoriented but conscious, Johnson recounts. That almost never happens with sudden cardiac arrest. Typically, even when we get ROSC, return of spontaneous circulation, the patient remains unconscious and requires intensive support. The fact that this patient was already regaining consciousness speaks to the immediate, high-quality CPR he received. The teacher's response and proper use of the AED absolutely saved his life. Without her actions, he would have died before we got there. As the paramedics stabilized Michael and prepared to transport him to Portland General Hospital, he briefly regained enough awareness to make eye contact with Sarah. "Thank you," he whispered, before being wheeled out on the stretcher. With Michael rushed to the hospital, Sarah was left in a classroom of stunned students and the aftermath of a medical emergency, discarded AED packaging, the lingering scent of antiseptic from the emergency kit, and 23 teenagers processing what they had just witnessed. After the paramedics left, I just sat at my desk trembling, Sarah admits. "You don't process what's happening during an emergency, training and instinct take over, and you just act. The emotion, the fear, the doubt, it all hits you afterward." Principal Miller arrived and arranged for another teacher to take over Sarah's class. The school counselor came to speak with the students who had witnessed the event, offering support for those distressed by the experience. Classes continued throughout the building, but word of Sarah's life-saving actions spread quickly through the school community. I went home early that day. I called the hospital but could only confirm that he had been admitted and was in stable condition. Privacy regulations prevented them from telling me more. I showered, trying to wash away the stress of the day, and then collapsed into bed, completely drained. That evening, around 8 p.m., I received an email from Portland General Hospital. Michael was stable and had asked specifically to see me. I was surprised but relieved he was doing well enough to have visitors. What Sarah didn't know was that her visit to Portland General Hospital the next day would reveal an extraordinary twist in the story, one that would challenge everything she thought she knew about that day's events. The following afternoon, Sarah made her way through the antiseptic-scented corridors of Portland General's cardiac care unit. She had brought a simple get-well card signed by her students and a small plant, gestures that seemed simultaneously appropriate and inadequate for someone whose life you've saved. When she reached room 412 and knocked softly on the partially open door, a woman's voice called for her to enter. As Sarah stepped into the room, she saw a woman about her own age standing by the window, elegant, with short black hair and a professional demeanor. By the bed sat Michael, looking remarkably improved though still connected to cardiac monitors and an 4. When I walked into his room, there was a woman there, his wife, I assumed, and she had this strange expression, almost like she was amused, which seemed odd given the circumstances. And then Michael sat up in bed and said, "I believe I owe you an explanation, Ms. Donovan." The man she knew as Michael Chen introduced the woman as Dr. Helen Park, Chief of Medicine at Portland General. He then revealed his own identity. "My name is actually Dr. James Chen. I'm a cardiologist at Portland General, specializing in electrophysiology, heart rhythm disorders." Sarah stood stunned, the small plant still clutched in her hands, as Dr. Chen explained the situation. He was not a student at all. He was a respected cardiologist with over 15 years of practice, who had been participating in a unique medical education initiative, one that Sarah had never been informed about. Our hospital had launched a program to evaluate CPR and emergency response training in community settings, Dr. Chen explained. With proper approvals and coordination with the school administration, several healthcare professionals had enrolled in adult education classes to observe emergency preparedness. I was assigned to Westridge High because of your biology curriculum's strong focus on human physiology. Dr. Helen Park elaborated on the program. We've been increasingly concerned about response times and preparedness for cardiac events in public settings. While we can control the environment in hospitals, most cardiac arrests happen elsewhere. This observation program was designed to help us identify gaps in emergency response preparation in schools, community centers, and other public spaces where many people gather. The program was fully approved by our Institutional Review Board and the school district, Dr. Chen added. The principals of participating schools were informed, but teachers were not. We needed authentic environments to observe. What we never anticipated was that one of our observer physicians would experience a real medical emergency during the observation period. Sarah finally found her voice. So you were evaluating me? Testing me somehow? Not testing, Dr. Chen corrected gently. Observing the general environment. Is emergency equipment accessible? Are staff trained? Would they know what to do? Would they act quickly? We weren't singling out individual teachers. The ultimate irony, he continued, is that I have a congenital heart condition, long QT syndrome. I've managed it my entire life with medication and lifestyle modifications, and it's been completely stable for years. But that day, despite taking my medication, I experienced a sudden arrhythmia during class. And the teacher I was secretly evaluating ended up saving my life using exactly the skills and equipment our program was designed to assess. I was stunned, Sarah recalls. First to learn he wasn't really a student, and then to discover that a cardiologist had experienced cardiac arrest in my cardiology lesson. The coincidence seemed impossible. I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief that he was okay, confusion about the deception, and honestly, a bit of professional pride that I had performed well under pressure. In front of a cardiac specialist of all people. Dr. Chen reached for his medical chart at the foot of his bed and showed it to Sarah. What impressed me most was that everything Sarah did followed perfect advanced cardiac life support protocols. Her CPR technique was flawless based on the muscle enzyme levels we measured, which tell us about compression quality. Her AED usage was textbook perfect. The data from the AED shows that her compressions were at the optimal depth and rate, a level of quality achieved by only about 23% of trained professionals during actual emergencies. As Dr. Chen recovered over the next few days, Sarah visited again. Rather than feeling deceived, she became increasingly fascinated by the observation program and its goals. She and Dr. Chen began discussing gaps in emergency training for teachers and school staff. Once I got past the initial shock, I understood what they were trying to accomplish, Sarah explains. They wanted to know if regular people in community settings could respond effectively to emergencies. I was just doing what any teacher with my background would do. But that's exactly the point, counters Dr. Chen. Not every teacher has your background. Not every school has AEDs. Not every person with CPR certification remembers what to do when faced with a real emergency rather than a practice dummy. You were exceptional. During one visit, Dr. Chen shared with Sarah the complete data from the AED she had used. Modern AEDs don't just deliver shocks, they record detailed information about the emergency response, the heart rhythm, the timing and quality of compressions, and how quickly appropriate interventions were provided. The data confirmed what I experienced firsthand, Dr. Chen says. Sarah didn't just save my life, she provided the highest quality of emergency care possible outside of a hospital setting. When we analyzed the timeline, from my collapse to the delivery of the shock, only 7 minutes had elapsed. In cardiac care, we have a saying, time is muscle. Every minute counts. Sarah's immediate response preserved not just my life but my quality of life. As Dr. Chen prepared for discharge, he and Sarah had increasingly detailed discussions about emergency response training in schools. What began as casual conversation evolved into serious professional dialogue. I started to see how my two worlds, medical science and education, could come together. Sarah says. Dr. Chen had the clinical expertise and hospital connections, and I understood the realities of school environments and educational approaches. We both became excited about the possibility of creating something new. 6 months after that fateful day in the classroom, Sarah Donovan and Dr. James Chen now work together, but in a capacity neither could have predicted. While continuing her full-time teaching position, Sarah now dedicates her summers and one weekend a month to a new program they've created together. Dr. Chen approached me about combining our expertise, Sarah explains. He had the medical credentials and research capabilities, and I had the educational experience and understanding of school environments. Together, we developed a program to bring enhanced emergency response training to schools throughout the Pacific Northwest. The Donovan Protocol, as we're calling it, adapts medical training techniques for educational settings, Dr. Chen elaborates. Traditional CPR training often fails because it's treated as a one-time certification that people rarely practice or refresh. Our program embeds regular micro-practice sessions into routine school activities, reinforces skills through simulation, and addresses the psychological barriers that often prevent people from acting in emergencies. Funded through a combination of hospital community outreach money, educational grants, and a small foundation established by Dr. Chen to honor Sarah's intervention, the program has already been implemented in 28 schools across Oregon, with plans to expand to Washington and Idaho in the coming year. The beauty of this program is that it's designed by educators for educators, Sarah emphasizes. We understand the constraints of school budgets, the limited time available for professional development, and the realities of the classroom. We've created something that works within those limitations rather than adding another burden to already stretched school staff. The program has shown promising early results. In schools that have implemented the Donovan Protocol for at least 3 months, staff demonstrate significantly higher retention of emergency response skills, increased confidence in crisis situations, and measurable improvements in response times during simulated emergencies. Beyond its practical impact, the program has given Sarah a new perspective on her career path. For years, I occasionally wondered if I had made the right choice leaving medical research for teaching, she admits. I loved my students and my work, but there was always that question in the back of my mind: what discoveries might I have made in the lab? Had I abandoned my potential to make a broader impact? Now, those doubts have been resolved. I still teach biology every day. That hasn't changed, Sarah says. But now I also know that my abandoned medical training found its purpose after all. The path wasn't what I expected, but it led exactly where it needed to go. For Dr. Chen, the partnership has been equally transformative. My cardiac event and Sarah's intervention changed how I think about medical training, he explains. For years, I focused on training other cardiologists and medical professionals. Now I see the critical importance of extending that knowledge beyond hospital walls, into communities where emergencies actually happen. Sometimes the most meaningful connections in our lives come from the most unexpected circumstances, reflects Dr. Chen. I went into her classroom as an observer and left as a patient whose life she saved. Now we're colleagues working to save more lives. If that's not evidence that life has a sense of irony, or perhaps purpose, I don't know what is. Sarah's students have gained a unique perspective from her experience as well. Her biology classes now regularly include guest lectures from Dr. Chen, and her curriculum incorporates even more practical applications of scientific knowledge. My students see that learning isn't abstract, Sarah says. Knowledge has power, not just for future careers or college applications, but in the most fundamental ways. What you learn today might save a life tomorrow. A teacher who once left medicine behind. A doctor who posed as a student. And a life-saving moment that revealed their shared purpose. Sarah Donovan's story reminds us that sometimes our greatest contributions come when we least expect them, and that knowledge, wherever and whenever it's acquired, has the power to save lives. So here's a question for you: what unexpected skills from your past might you be carrying right now that could make all the difference in someone else's future? Have you ever had training or knowledge that came back to help you when you least expected it? Share your story in the comments below. If you believe that everyday heroes like Sarah deserve recognition, hit that subscribe button and join our community. Together, we'll explore more extraordinary true stories of ordinary people who rose to extraordinary moments. And don't forget to tap that notification bell, because you never know when the next incredible story might arrive that could change how you see the world, or even save a life. Until next time, remember, sometimes the most important lessons we learn aren't the ones we're looking for, but the ones that find us when we need them most. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share this video.